Okay, this is a follow-up video on the Nozick lecture that had part of it missing. Um, the recording device um, lost its battery charge, so um, there's only a small part of the discussion that you will have missed if you're relying on this video. So I'm going to cover that, so it would have been the last part of that video up until where the next lecture starts. So towards the end of the video, in the classroom, we were discussing Robert Nozick's Will Chamberlain example, and it's supposed to be an argument that puts pressure on a pattern or an end state theory. And the basic argument, right, it's very simple. He says, look, whatever distributive theory you're going to have for any distribution, for any pattern, it's going to be the case that if you allow people to transfer the stuff, they'll mess up the pattern. And so the Will Chamberlain example is just a very simple example of where one person's freedom to make more and a bunch of spectators' freedom to just give a simple quarter of their money to Wilt messes up the distribution. So here's the basic argument, the one we discussed in class, right? So Nozick thinks, look, if we start with a distribution that's just, and you can assume whatever distribution you like, perfect equality or whatever, and we accept that people have a right to transfer their money. Nobody gets stuff gets stolen, nobody gets forced, nobody gets duped, whatever, right? Then you end up with a D2 distribution, and he says, well, if the beginning was just, and the way we went from 1 to 2 is just, then the outcome must be just too. Just as well. And there's the little argument going on. Now, towards the end of the class, I asked students to think about how you might challenge this idea, right? So the basic claim is that these kind of transfers that people, the spectators on Wilt are engaging in, are justice preserving, so that what we put in, if what we put in is just, then what comes out must be just too. And if you believe that, then you cannot have anything like a theory of social justice like Rawls wants to have. Rawls wants to think that even if everybody acts fine, even if everybody acts permissively, if the inequalities that result don't maximally benefit the least well off, it's unjust. And that's the thing that Nozick is challenging here. So, how might you test this, right? Nozick says that Rawlsian idea makes no sense because legitimate transfer is justice preserving. Just like inferences are truth preserving. He draws an analogy there. So how might you test it? Well, you cannot, right? This is what I said at the end. You cannot just point to the inequality and say it's unjust, because that's exactly the thing we're wondering about, whether it is unjust or not. So maybe some other way. Well, you might think of a counterexample. So G.A. Cohen, who we'll read later in this term, although a different piece from the same book, he says, look, I have a counterexample. Here's a case where no person does something that's unjust, but an injustice is introduced. So he says, suppose you live up on a hill, and I live down on a hill, and you leave your kitchen door open, and your rolling pin rolls off there. A breeze hits, right? A breeze hits the rolling pin rolls off the kitchen table, out of the door, down the hill, into my door, which is also open, and now it's in my kitchen. And Cohen says, well, justice requires that you have access to your rolling pin, and I should return it to you. But, of course, the rolling pin being, like, even though it's true that I don't have a right to hold on to your rolling pin in my kitchen, it's not because I stole it, it's not because I duped you, and so on. So he says, look, there's a counterexample. It's injustice introduced because despite no injustice happened, and so, Rawls, you want to tell me that transfers that are legitimate, that involve no rights violations, are justice preserving. Not everything that involves no rights violations is justice preserving because the rolling pin is a problem. It's kind of a silly example, but he's just trying to show, look, it's possible that without injustices happening, injustice can be created. And that's all you need for a social justice view. That's all you need for the argument of the previous slide to be broken up. because then it's not true that legitimate transfers are always just to preserving. Justice can be violated in other sorts of ways. Okay, so that's one way. Here's another way. You might have a draw an analogy or compare the case. Maybe if it's true that not all just, or at least not unjust, means of transitioning from one situation to another, where the means of transitioning is also just, or at least not unjust, preserve justice. Maybe that's not always true, right? So here's one way you might think, you might put pressure on what Nozick is saying. You might say, well, you wouldn't think this, Nozick, if nobody acts. And so Nozick actually believes this. He said later in the book, later this term we'll look at this, but Nozick says, suppose that we all live on a desert island. The desert island has a couple of water holes. We all appropriate one water hole, so we all have access to clean water. And now one day, by just sheer luck or bad luck, all the watering holes except one dry up. Nozick thinks, well, even though nobody acted that way, that if I'm the one who has the last water hole, I don't get to just exclude you guys from my water, like I would have been my right before. And if I do exclude you, it's unjust. But notice that it's nobody's fault that the water holes have dried up. It's just nature. And so nobody acted, zero people acted, but an injustice can be introduced. My property right over the water hole is no longer legitimate. I cannot exclude you anymore. So Nozick does not believe that if nobody's rights are being violated, that no injustice can be introduced, because the watering holes example is a counterexample. Nozick also doesn't think that if one person acts, no injustice can be introduced, because he does think that if I unilaterally acquire all the water holes before they dry up, this is still wrong, because other people have a right to access their water. And so even if I own all the watering holes, then I might be limited only to ask a certain price, and so on. All sorts of things start happening that normally wouldn't happen. So if I myself am the one who appropriates all the water holes on the island, that means that you guys are excluded in a way that is wrong. But I didn't violate any rights. I didn't beat anyone up. I didn't dupe anyone when I just appropriated all the water holes. And so if one person acts, then it seems that even though there's no violations, an injustice can be introduced. So then the question is, well, if it's possible when nobody acts, then an injustice is introduced, even though no wrong was done. And if it's possible if one person acts, then why would it be different if two persons act, namely in a contract or an exchange? So that's another way you might put pressure on the idea here. Say, well, hey, Nozick, is this really true? Maybe not. Cohen gives the counterexample where two people are involved. And another way you might say is by analogy. Say, well, if zero people are involved, this is not true. If one person is involved, this is not true. I don't see why I would believe this for two persons. So together, I think that gives you quite a bit of leeway to wiggle out of this argument. Okay, so that's one version of the Will Chamberlain argument. The first version is the D1 to D2 argument. There can be no injustice here because nothing wrong is being done. And these are ways you might resist that. Here's a second version of the argument. Nozick discusses both kind of side by side, so I'm trying to discuss them separately so you can keep them separate in your mind. Nozick thinks that if we want to resist the Will Chamberlain example, what's happening in the example, we have to unacceptably limit people's freedom, in particular the freedom to exchange. So here's the argument, right? First premise, a distribution is patterned if the allocation tracks a certain underlying feature. That's just Nozick's definition of a pattern distribution. So it's patterned if it tracks a certain underlying feature. So maybe you want to have full equality of possessions because you want to track the underlying feature of equal moral worth of people. Or maybe you think people can make more money if they deserve to make more money. Then it's a pattern distribution because the distribution should track people's deservingness or desert. And so on. So first premise, that's just what it is, right? Definition of a pattern distribution. Second premise, when individuals are free to transfer their rightful holdings, basically decide who they're going to pay, who they're going to give their money to, and so on, they can and they likely will transfer them in some ways that are non-patterned, that do not follow the underlying feature. They do not choose people because they're equally morally worthy, but they choose them because they have a good deal. Right? When you go to the supermarket, you're not thinking about, are these equal people to me? No, you're thinking about the meat is on sale. So here's I have a quote here that you can look at. He lists all the ways in which you can make money that do not seem to track any type of underlying pattern, but are just random ways. And we could add ways in which you would lose money too. Okay, so there's two premises. So therefore, it follows that for any pattern, whatever the pattern might be, equality, deservingness, need, you name it. If it's true that people are free to transfer their holdings, then the pattern will be upset. And so that's why Nozick can start with D1 as a variable, right? He says, just plug in your favorite distribution. He says, I'll show you how it gets messed up in no time. Well, if it's true then that people who are free to exchange will mess up their pattern, then it follows, here's 4, that if we're going to keep the pattern, then we have to do one of two things. Either what he calls a socialist society, so this is a society that would like to keep the pattern, will have to forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults. It's a funny phrase by Nozick. He's comparing it to sexual morality. Right? He says, hey people, especially sort of the left-wing liberal who he's attacking, right? He says, you think we shouldn't prevent, say, gay people from having sex or gay people from getting married because these are sexual acts between consenting adults and the consent is good enough to legitimize it. Well, if you think that, then what's wrong about capitalist acts between consenting adults? So he's kind of hoist them on their own petard, if you will. So, okay, that's one option, right? Just forbid these acts. So just tell the people who want to go see Wild and tell Wild, no, you do not get to put your box for the quarter there. Maybe that means Wild never plays basketball, but you'll live with that. One option. Or what you can do is, of course, you can allow these exchanges to happen. So you can allow the people to pay Wild, but then afterwards undo it, right? So you tax Wild. You say, hey, Wild, all well and good that you ask people to give all these quarters, but we like equality better, so we're going to take all those quarters again out of your pocket and give them back to the people. Or give them back to whoever needs it most, or whoever has the least, or whatever you prefer the view is. So those are the only two ways you can keep your pattern in place, right? So either you forbid the things that would upset the pattern, or you repair them after they take place. The first is forbidding these capitalist acts. It's just people paying a little quarter more for a ticket. That is a capitalist act. Or continuously interfere with their lives, right? So like say, okay, you spent the quarter and I undo it. Take it back. But he says neither option is acceptable, morally or practical, because to forbid these acts is just an enormous limit on freedom. It's an enormous limit on, it's kind of condescending too, right? You can't even decide what you do with your money. He thinks it's individualism with a vengeance, because now what we allow is we allow it to spend it on yourself, but you can't spend it on Wild. You can't spend it on your kids, you can't spend it on your friends. And so it follows then that maintaining a pattern society is just not acceptable. That's the freedom-based argument. The first one is about, well, no injustice is introduced, so there can be no injustice here at all. And the second version is, even if we grant that you might be worried about this, any measure of repairing this is unacceptably limiting of people's freedom. You're really not taking them seriously as free people, he thinks. One question to ask yourself, we talked a little bit about this in class, is why are both these options in 4 unacceptable? You might think it's pretty obvious that we should allow people to exchange money, goods, services, and so on. So maybe we can see why the first option is not acceptable. But the second option, it's a little more questionable for 2 reasons. One, practical. We live in this world, right? We live in a world in which at the end of the year, the IRS tells you you've made a bunch of transfers. They don't quite fit what we think should happen in the society. They don't. You need stuff needs to be paid for, or we need to have redistributive taxation. So we're going to take some from you and give it to others. That happens, right? And Nozick thinks this is unacceptable limitation of freedom. It's really meddling. So ask yourself: is he right about this? Is what you're undergoing that bad? Doesn't have to be practically bad, right? But Nozick does think it is an infringement on your freedom, and it might irritate you, and with good reason, he would say. So that's the practical side, maybe. Here's the more moral side, moral objection. So the practical objection is, well, we do this and people are fine. The more moral objection is this. This is another argument that G.A. Cohen made. It says, well, Nozick says these taxation is really interfering, and therefore we should stop it. But Cohen says, what is also really interfering? Just property rights in general. It means that people who really need stuff, water holes, money, access to education, what have you, healthcare, they can't just get it or can't just take it when they need it. They have to save money, or they have to ask people's cooperation. They have to not take it if they can't afford it, and so there's interference either way. He's not saying necessarily this is a bad idea, although Cohen did think it was a bad idea. He's just saying, Luke knows that you cannot rely on the argument that this is interfering. If you're going to object to interference, then we have to roll the ball all the way back and say, well, then we shouldn't have any property rights at all, because property rights interfere too. If we're going to allow that type of interference, where we constantly interfere in our daily lives, I can't just take what I want, I can't go from A to B in a straight line because I'd be trespassing on people's property, I have to navigate around it and so on. If I have to respect all that type of interference, then why shouldn't we also accept the type of interference that the IRS engages in? Maybe that's just part of the same package. That's actually a pretty powerful objection, I think. If Nozick wants to rely on an interference argument, he's kind of assuming that he's right to begin with. You can't. Here's the individualism with a vengeance argument. He says, well, that's the best argument I think that Nozick has here. He says, well, maybe it's not just interference. Even if property does interfere as well, there is always the following objection, which is any view will allow that whatever you hold, whatever your possessions are, you can use on yourself. You can eat your food, you can live in your house, you can wear your clothes. Right? But why on earth would you ever accept a theory that allows you to take or use the things for yourself, but not for others? Why could you not share your food with your neighbor, your friend, your child, a stranger? Why could you not spend your money on helping your neighbor, your friend, your child, a stranger? But if you can, right, then it seems that we're allowing all these capitalist acts already. And if we allow the capitalist acts, then there seems something wrong about a theory that says we have to undo it. Because whenever we say we undo it, we are undoing people's freedom to benefit the people they choose to benefit. And Nozick's ultimate point, I think, here is to say that there's something important about allowing people that freedom. And that's the kind of freedom that the Will Chamberlain example shows you. If you're going to take that freedom seriously, you're going to have to accept that patterns really are no part of a just society. All right, that more or less covers what we discussed and what was missing on the video. The next part is the argument from taxation and forced labor, and you can find that in the next video that's on YouTube.